In late 2002, 25-year-old Jason Chase worked as a sheep shearer in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of New Zealand. When Jason wasn't working, he was often on his bike, cycling up and down the coast, preparing for his next road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small town called Dannevirke, which is located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne, and he told them that he wanted to come visit them for Christmas. However, he didn't know exactly when he would actually arrive at their house because his training and work schedule were fairly hectic, but he told them, "Don't worry, I will be there at least on Christmas Day, December 25th, or a couple of days earlier." His family was thrilled, and they said, "No problem, we can't wait to see you whenever that is." And so by the time mid-December rolled around and Jason still had not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, his family wasn't concerned at all. However, that would soon change. On December 13th, a hunter was driving along the many winding back roads of the Ruahine mountain range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of Dannevirke, is a very isolated and rugged wilderness area that's full of steep gorges and gullies and very thick brush. And so as this hunter rounds the turn on this road, he looks up ahead and he sees there's a car parked on the side of the road. And so this hunter pulls up right alongside this car and he looks over and he can tell, there's no one inside of it. There's no obvious damage to the car. And then the hunter began kind of scanning around the area to see if there was some obvious reason someone would stop right at that particular spot. But when he looked around, all he saw was thick trees on either side, and the mountain kind of sloped down on either side. And so there was nothing unique about this spot. And so something just kind of struck the hunter as odd about this car. It just seemed totally out of place. And so operating on a hunch, the hunter would leave the mountain range and head into Dannevirke, and he would contact police and he would tell them about this car and where it was located, because in the hunter's mind, maybe someone had been reported missing in the area and maybe this car is connected. And so after hearing about the car, the police did not know of any missing person cases that were connected to a car that matched the description the hunter had given. But just to be safe, the police hopped in their vehicles and they drove up into the Ruahine mountain range and they went to the spot the hunter described. And sure enough, off to the side of the road is this parked car, and it's still unoccupied. After inspecting the vehicle, the police came to the same conclusion the hunter did, that there was no obvious signs of damage to the car that might have forced someone to abandon it. And then when they looked in the window at the gas gauge, they saw the gauge was full. And so the police kind of wandered around the area, kind of doing an initial search to see if maybe the owner of this car was nearby. But, there was no one there. They're in this very isolated part of this wilderness area. And so the police just took down the license plate of the car and they went back to their station. And when they got there, they ran the license plate number, and it turned out the car belonged to Jason Chase. When Jason's family was contacted about, why is Jason's car up in the Ruahine Mountains, where's Jason? His family was pretty surprised. They explained to police that Jason had made plans to come visit them around Christmas time, and so they were expecting him to come this way. And the Ruahine mountain range, it is only 8 miles away from Dannevirke, so in theory maybe he stopped there on the way to their house, but they told police that just didn't make any sense. So as a precaution, the police decided to launch a search for Jason. And unfortunately, despite hundreds of people on the ground searching the Ruahine mountain range and helicopters overhead flying all over the place, no trace of Jason was found. And so the official search was called off right before Christmas, but Jason's family and friends, they continued to look for him. And on January 3rd, they would find him. One of the family friends who had agreed to continue looking for Jason after the official search had shut down was a farmer who owned a plane. And on January 3rd, as he did one of his passes over the foothills of the Ruahine mountain range, he looked down and he saw this bright red thing that looked totally out of place. And the pilot couldn't tell what it was, and so he took note of its location, and then when he landed, he passed those coordinates off to the ground team. And so the ground team, they made their way over to this location, which was quite far away from where Jason's car had been. And after making their way through some very thick brush and some very steep sections, they eventually walked out to this big open clearing. It was a dry riverbed, and right in front of them, in the middle of it, was the bright red thing. It was Jason's shirt. And Jason was still wearing it. He was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out. He had on his bright red rugby t-shirt, some khaki shorts on, and he had no shoes or socks on. According to the searchers who first saw Jason in this dry creek bed, they would say the scene was very peaceful and it almost looked like Jason had lied down to fall asleep. But Jason was not sleeping, he was dead. Jason had no visible injuries, and there was no sign of a struggle in the area. In fact, it didn't even look like Jason had been in the wild for very long because his clothes were pristine, and despite being barefoot, his feet were in great condition. Despite a lengthy search around the area where his body was discovered, his shoes and socks would not be recovered. The only thing they found in the area was a water bottle that belonged to Jason. Adding to the mystery of what happened to Jason were the results of his autopsy. The pathologist was unable to find any injuries. Jason also seemed well nourished because he had food in his stomach, and he was hydrated because there was urine in his bladder. His toxicology report also came back negative for all drugs, medications, and a range of common poisons. The only odd thing the pathologist found during the autopsy was that Jason had 2 very small ulcers in his duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. According to this pathologist, these type of ulcers only appear from acute stress moments before death. However, these ulcers don't indicate what caused the stress. Typically, things like severe injury or septicemia, which is blood poisoning, will cause these stress ulcers. But Jason had neither of those. So at the end of the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that Jason had not been the victim of a homicide, he had not committed suicide, he had died from, quote, obscure natural causes. Interestingly though, the pathologist was able to determine with some certainty that Jason died on or around December 30th. Which means he was alive for the entirety of the official search for him, as well as the bulk of that private search conducted by friends and family. After the autopsy results came out, Jason's case was closed, and his family, despite having lots of unanswered questions, was forced to just move on. 15 years later, the same pathologist that had conducted Jason's autopsy was talking to a colleague about Jason's case, and as he was describing where Jason was found, the colleague suddenly stopped the pathologist and said, "Wait a minute, I think I know what happened to him." And it would turn out he did. The following is a reconstruction of what happened to Jason Chase. On December 13th, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and began heading south towards Dannevirke, where his family lived. But before he got to his family's home, he took a detour up into the Ruahine mountain range, where he eventually parked his car on the side of the road. Once his car was stopped, he got out and collected his backpack and sleeping bag. Those were 2 items that were never discovered during the search or after his body was found, but it was later determined they were missing from his vehicle. And so after he has his pack and his sleeping bag, he also grabs a water bottle, and then he leaves the main road and begins walking into the woods, making his way down the mountain. He eventually would find a spot on the side of the mountain that he liked, and so he set up a campsite. What happens next is very confusing because we don't actually know why Jason actually went camping in the first place or when he intended to leave, but we can make one assumption. Whatever he was doing in the mountains, he planned on wrapping it up in time to still get to his family's house in Dannevirke on or before Christmas Day, December 25th. So from December 13th, when he first got out of his car and entered the wilderness, until December 25th, it's believed Jason was, by choice, out in the wilderness of the Ruahine mountain range. And so as this huge search is launched for him in the area he is in, it's entirely possible that he either did not see any of the searchers. This is a very rugged and heavily forested area, and so that's not totally outlandish. Or 2, even if he did see the searchers, he may not have recognized that they were looking for him, because remember, during that time frame, he didn't think he was in danger. He was out in the wilderness camping by choice. But sometime around December 25th, or maybe a couple of days before, when he needed to leave and go back to Dannevirke to see his family, after packing up his stuff, for whatever reason, he could not get back up to the road where his car was. Either there was some sort of physical boundary, or maybe he got lost. But either way, instead of going back up the mountain, we know Jason actually turned and began going down the mountain. mountain, away from the road and away from his car. It's believed Jason actually just decided he would hike his way out of the mountains. He was in great shape, very healthy guy, and he probably figured he could just hike the 8 miles to Dannevirke, and then he could have someone drive him back up and retrieve his car at a later date. But on or around December 30th, Jason was still out in the mountains. And at this point, he had abandoned his backpack and his sleeping bag and had most likely removed his shoes and socks for reasons we don't know. But he had managed to get much closer to Dannevirke. He just had to navigate a few more steep sections and then he'd be home free. And so on or around December 30th, Jason began slowly making his way down the mountainside until he reached a decision point. He found himself standing at the top of 2 very steep gullies that both would bring him down to a dry stretch of riverbed, and so either option worked. It just became a matter of which one is safer. And so after making his assessment about which gully he should take, he made his choice and he made his way down and he reached the dry riverbed. And it was at this point that Jason would have begun to feel a pain in his stomach. And that pain would have gotten worse and worse and worse to the point where Jason likely sat down on this dry riverbed, kind of waiting for the pain to subside, but it wouldn't. It would only intensify. And so as he's sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, his vision would begin to blur, and then he would start to struggle breathing. And before he could deal with all of these strange symptoms that were coming on really suddenly, he lost the ability to move his body and he slumped over onto his left side, and there he would lay until he died. It would turn out the gully that Jason had chosen to go down when he was standing at the top and he had those 2 choices, the one he chose, that one contained a plant called Urtica ferox. This plant, which is endemic to New Zealand, grows leaves that are covered in little rigid stinging hairs that contain a toxin called trifidin. And trifidin, in high enough doses, not only causes stomach pain and blurred vision and trouble breathing, but it also causes total body paralysis and even death. Jason, who according to friends would have known about the dangers this plant posed, likely just didn't see the cluster of plants when he was assessing which gully to go down. And so it wasn't until he was partway down the gully and was in these plants that he realized his mistake. But when he turned to go back up, it was just too steep. And so he was forced to trudge through these toxic plants. And because he was wearing shorts, his lower legs were exposed and they were stung repeatedly. And so he was dealt a lethal dose. The reason the pathologist was not able to identify this as Jason's cause of death is because the stingers on those plants, they don't leave any marks on the human body. And its poison, trifidin, is so rare that when they sent out that toxicology report, they didn't include it. They did not test for trifidin. And so it wasn't until 15 years later when the pathologist's colleague heard that Jason had been found in the Ruahine Mountains that the colleague said, wait a minute, have you checked for trifidin? Because he knew the Ruahine Mountains were home to clusters of that toxic plant. And so sure enough, they went back to where Jason's body had been found, and lining the gully that he had come down were dozens and dozens of those plants. In October of 1994, a middle-aged man named Ivan, who lived in Estonia, which is a country in Northern Europe, was walking in this forest looking for firewood. This forest butted up against the town he lived in, which was called Tamiku, and so as a result of his proximity to it, he had spent a lot of time in these woods over the years. But in general, his exposure to this forest was just on the fringes. He would only look for firewood along the perimeter of the woods. But for whatever reason, that day he was just really having a hard time finding good firewood, and so at some point he decided to just walk deeper into the woods to see if he would have luck in there. And so he turns and starts walking into the forest, and very quickly, when the town has kind of disappeared from view behind him, he looked around and kind of liked being in the woods. He didn't go for walks in the woods, and suddenly he was on this nice nature walk. And so he decided, you know what, I can wait on the firewood. I'll just walk in the forest for a little while longer and enjoy myself and kind of meditate. So he just continued walking walking deeper and deeper into the woods. And after walking for nearly an hour, just kind of mindlessly walking about, he sees up ahead there is very clearly a clearing, and then before the clearing is what looks like a chain link fence. Now, he's never been this deep into the woods before, so he has no idea what this is, but he's obviously curious, and so he decides he'll go see what it is. And so he continues walking closer and closer to what obviously is a chain link fence, and as he's getting closer to it, the trees around him are beginning to thin out, and suddenly, before he even reaches the fence, he gets a very clear view of what's on the other side. And it's this huge multi-story building that almost looks like a factory or some sort of government facility, and it's sitting maybe a couple hundred feet away from the fence, right in the middle of this property, and there's really nothing around it. It's just this cleared out big open area with this big building right in the middle, and there's a fence all the way around it. And so Ivan is totally intrigued by this, and so he walks right up to the fence, he grabs onto it, and he tries to look and figure out what this building is, but there's no clear signage on it, and there's no people anywhere. It's completely barren. There's nothing but this building. And then he notices there's obviously graffiti on the sides of this building, and the doors and windows appeared to be boarded up. And so this building, whatever it is clearly abandoned. And the first thought that goes through Ivan's head is scrap metal. Times were tough for Ivan and his family, and so he and his two brothers, they all lived together, they would go out and they would steal scrap metal and sell it for a little bit of extra cash to make ends meet and provide for their big family. And so he's looking at this big building thinking, you know, if I can get in there, I guarantee you there is some metal that I can steal and I can sell. And so Ivan stayed at this fence just kind of staring at this building for a little while longer and continued to look around to make sure there weren't any people that he hadn't seen before. And after feeling satisfied that this really was a totally abandoned building, he turned around and began hustling back towards town. And when he finally made it to town, making sure to grab some firewood along the way, he rounded up his two brothers and he told them about this find in the forest. And they all very excitedly agreed that that night they would go right back out there and they would go inside the building and see what they could find. And so around 9 p.m. that night, the brothers met up and they had flashlights and a set of bolt cutters, and they headed into the nearby forest and they marched their way all the way up to this fence that Ivan had found earlier in the day. And they lifted their flashlights up and they scanned through the fence all over the property. And when they didn't see anyone, they put their flashlights down and one by one they climbed up and over this fence. And then once they were all on the other side, they began making their way up to this huge building sitting in the middle of the property. And when they got up to this building, they confirmed it definitely looked like it was abandoned, except all of the doors and windows were sealed in such a way that even with bolt cutters, there was just no way to pry them open. They were not going to get inside this building. And so after a little while of still trying to kind of smash their way into this building, the brothers all linked up and they decided, you know what, we're not getting in, and the longer we stay here, the better the chances are that we get caught. And so let's just head back. And so feeling totally dejected, they turn and they start walking back towards the fence they hopped in on. And as they're walking along, they're kind of shining their lights left and right and looking around. And off to the far right side of the property, there is this small shack that they had not noticed on their way in. And so the brothers look at each other and they're like, hey, you know, we're already on this side of the fence. We might as well go check it out and see what's inside of it. Maybe there's scrap metal in there. And so the brothers turn and start making their way over to the shed. And when they get there, they discover it's only secured with a simple padlock on a wooden door. And so they get their bolt cutters, they pop off the lock, they open up the door, and there's initially nothing inside. At least that's what they think. But they move something on the ground and it reveals this stairwell that leads into this underground bunker. And now it's the middle of the night on this abandoned property they've snuck into. And so there's some apprehension, but they shine their lights down the steps and they didn't see any immediate hazards. And they're thinking, you know what, this is an adventure. Let's go down and see what's down there. And so they all went down the steps. And when they got down to the bottom, they turned the corner and they shined their light to see what's down here. And what was down there was this huge cellar that was full of scrap metal. There was metal all over the ground, and then there were also these shelves that went as far back as their lights could shine, and on the lower shelves there were these weird square metal boxes that almost looked like briefcases, and then above those on the top shelf were 55-gallon aluminum drums. And in the brothers' experience, these drums were very, very valuable, except they needed to make sure they weren't full of some liquid, because if they're full, they weigh like 500 pounds, and there's no way they'd be able to get them out, and then trying to open them up and spill whatever's inside of them is hazardous for a lot of reasons. And so they walked over to the first 55-gallon drum they saw, and they pushed it to see if it was empty. And the drum immediately rocked back and forth, echoing inside, indicating that it was empty. This was a huge, huge win. And so the brothers are totally amazed. They grab this first drum, they pull it off the shelf, and they wheel it over to the base of the steps. And then they go back to get another drum off the shelf, and they reach up, they grab another empty drum, and as they're pulling it off, it dislodges another 55-gallon drum that was nearby that was full of some liquid. So it weighed 500 pounds, and it comes crashing off the shelf, and it lands on Ivan's leg, pinning him to the ground. And immediately the two other brothers pulled the drum off of Ivan, but it was obvious there had been significant damage done to his leg. Ivan couldn't even stand up anymore. And so the brothers are looking around thinking, man, this is an amazing haul, but if Ivan can't even walk, I mean, it's going to be a nightmare trying to haul this metal back while also supporting Ivan. And so they decided they would leave now, and they would wait for Ivan to heal up, and then they would come back and they would collect their amazing haul. And so the brothers, they reached down and they picked up whatever pieces of metal they could to just kind of stuff in their pockets. And then the two brothers supported Ivan and carried him up the stairs. And then they very slowly walked their way over to the fence. And then somehow the three of them got up and over the fence. And then very slowly they made their way all the way through the forest back to Tamiku. And when they got there, the two brothers helped Ivan get into his house, and they put him in his bed. And then Ivan went to sleep. The next morning when Ivan got up, he was expecting to feel better, but in fact, his leg felt exponentially worse. And then over the course of the next 72 hours, Ivan still believed if he just gutted it out and he waited, his leg would get better, but it just got worse and worse and worse. And so 4 days after this leg injury, Ivan was in so much pain, he couldn't do anything. And so he finally decided he had to go to the hospital. And so when he gets to the hospital, the doctor asks Ivan, what happened to your leg? And Ivan would tell him that, I was in the woods and a tree fell on my leg, because he didn't want to admit to trying to steal scrap metal. And so the doctors, they accepted this. It seemed totally reasonable based on what his injury looked like. And so they admitted him to the hospital. They put him in his hospital room. And right away, the doctors and nurses began administering all the treatments and things they would do for a crush injury. But it seemed like nothing was working. Over the course of the next several days, Ivan complained endlessly of the pain in his leg getting worse and worse and worse, and the swelling was going up, and overall Ivan's health just continued to deteriorate over his stay in the hospital. And then a week after being admitted to the hospital, so roughly 10 or 11 days after he was hurt, the doctors walked into his room and he was dead. His kidneys had just abruptly failed, and the doctors and nurses had absolutely no idea why. And so they told the family, we don't know what happened to him. And so the family just had to collect Ivan's body, and then they had a funeral for him. But they're all thinking to themselves, how could this have happened? He hurt his leg and then his kidneys failed? It didn't make any sense. But before they could get any clarity on that, they were dealt another tragedy. The beloved family dog just kind of abruptly died. It was young, it was healthy, and so just like Ivan, it was like this totally unexpected death. And so once again, the family's asking, what's going on here? And then just a couple of days after that, Ivan's stepson came downstairs one morning complaining of feeling sick. And when his family looked at his hands, they were blistered and covered in boils and looked like he had just reached his hands into a fire or something. But he would tell his family, I didn't do that. I don't know what's going on with my hands. I don't know why I feel so sick. And so the family rushed the boy to the hospital, and naturally the doctors asked him, how did your hands get this way? What happened to you? And the boy would say, I don't know. But over the course of this initial discussion with doctors, the boy would tell them that over the last couple of days, he had been sifting through his stepfather, Ivan's possessions, and he had actually been using some of Ivan's tools from his toolbox. Now, the doctors were already aware of the strangeness around Ivan's death, and they were aware of the sudden passing of the family dog, and now they're seeing this boy who is showing up with these strange symptoms for no particular reason. And so the doctors knew something was off. And so on a hunch, they contacted the authorities and they told them what they thought. And then later that day, the authorities showed up at Ivan's family's house. And when they got out of the car, they were covered head to toe in white hazardous materials suits. And they told the family to evacuate the house for their safety. empty. And then these people in suits got out these special wands and tools, and they marched into the family home, and immediately all their equipment led them to this one particular closet near the kitchen. And when they opened it up, in the closet was Ivan's toolbox, the same one the boy had been handling over the past couple of days. And when they opened that up, they found there were lots of normal tools you would expect inside of a toolbox, and they discovered one strange piece of scrap metal. It was the only piece of scrap metal that Ivan had grabbed off the floor of that cellar and tucked in his pocket before he and his brothers had left. And then after Ivan had passed away, his stepson had been going through his things, and he had discovered this piece of scrap metal, and for whatever reason, he had transferred it from the jacket to Ivan's toolbox. What Ivan and his family didn't know was that that piece of metal was extremely dangerous, because it came not from some abandoned building on some abandoned property in the middle of the forest. It came from an abandoned nuclear waste storage facility. That is what Ivan and his brothers had snuck onto. But because Ivan and his brothers had hopped over that side fence, they didn't see any of the warning signs that are posted on the front of the front gates telling people to stay back. Inside that cellar that the brothers were in, those small metal briefcase looking things on the lower shelves were shields for radiation. Inside of each of them was radioactive metal. And when that full 55-gallon drum came crashing off the shelf and smashed into Ivan's leg, his leg was not the only thing it smashed into. It smashed into one of those metal briefcases and broke it open, sending the radioactive metal inside of it flying out, and it landed right next to Ivan on the ground. And so when the brothers scrambled to pick up whatever loose scrap metal there was on the ground, Ivan unfortunately grabbed one piece, and it was the radioactive one. By the time Ivan finally got back to his house, he was actually already dead. He just didn't know it yet. That piece of metal had been inside of his jacket pocket, and it had been pressed against his body long enough that he had been dealt a fatal dose of radiation. There was nothing anybody could have done, even if they knew what had happened to him. As for the dog, it used to sleep on Ivan's jacket, and it did so when this piece of scrap metal was inside of it, and so it too died of radiation poisoning. As for Ivan's stepson, the reason his hands had been so badly burned and why he had become so sick, that was just from his brief exchange of touching the piece of scrap metal and then putting it in Ivan's toolbox. That alone had done that much damage to him. When the doctors considered the strangeness of Ivan's death, the dog's death, and now this boy's symptoms, they did suspect radiation poisoning, and so that was how the authorities were able to get to their house and very quickly locate that toolbox. Amazingly, Ivan's stepson and the rest of Ivan's family, including his two brothers, would make full recoveries. However, several months after this event, and after authorities had come in and said their house was clear of radiation, the grandmother would suddenly die totally unexpectedly. She was healthy, nothing was wrong with her, and so even though it was not officially cited as having been caused by radiation, many people believe it's from the exposure she had to this piece of scrap metal. In 2019, Meg Moorer was a 21-year-old senior at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was studying ecology and evolutionary biology and planned to pursue a career in scientific illustration after graduation. This was a field that combined her skill as a scientist, her incredible artistic ability, and her general love of nature. But despite her intellectual brilliance, what Meg was actually known for was her very uplifting personality. When her mother was asked what her daughter was like, she said, "Well, it's like trying to describe what it's like to feel the warmth of the sun. There are not words to accurately describe what that feels like." And that was Meg. She was radiant, she was joyous, she was adventuresome, she was kind, she was really just a wonderful person to be around. In March of that year, just 2 months before their graduation, Meg and two of her close friends decided to go on a trip for spring break. This would be their last spring break as students, and they wanted to enjoy it. Because they were all in excellent physical condition, they decided they would spend the week hiking in Georgia. When Meg told her family about her big plans, they could tell she was extremely excited, and they just told her, be safe and we'll see you when you get back. On the morning of their departure, which was March 5th, Meg packed her suitcase into the trunk of her small green sedan, and then she drove over to her two friends' apartment building, and they came out and they put their suitcases into the car, and then once the car was all packed and all three of them were inside, they hit the road. The drive from Tulane University to this area in Georgia where they'd be hiking took about 8 hours if you didn't stop. But none of them were were in a particularly big rush, and so they figured they would just stop along the way, and if they got to Georgia super late at night, so be it. After being on the road for 2 hours without stopping, they all needed to use the bathroom, and so Meg decided to pull over at the first rest stop she saw. And the first one she saw was in this residential town in Mississippi called Gaucher. So she pulls off the highway into this very nondescript rest stop, and all three of them get out. They go into the main building and they use the restroom. Meg was the first one to be done, so she came outside and she waited right near the bathroom door, and then her two friends, they finished up as well. They came out, and then the trio began walking back towards the parking lot where Meg's car was. At the same time, a man driving an 18-wheeler tractor-trailer truck was bombing down the highway right outside of this rest stop, and right before he was going to pass the area where this rest stop was, he heard something fall off the back of his truck. He instinctively checked both of his mirrors to see if maybe he could see what had fallen off, but he didn't see anything in the road, and so he just pulled over onto the shoulder and got out to see what was going on. When he walked towards the back of his truck, he expected to see, maybe one of the back doors had popped open or something like that. But even before he made it to the back of his truck and could even look at those back doors, he already knew what had fallen off the truck. 2 of his back tires were just gone. This truck had what's called dual rear wheels, which meant on the axle, there was not just one wheel on each side. Instead, there were 2 wheels on each side. So 4 wheels across one axle. And so each of these 2 wheels were bolted together and would turn at the same time and kind of functioned like one big fat tire. This gave the truck more stability and safety when it was towing. The driver, in a panic, looked back down the road in the direction he had just come, hoping to just see the tires somewhere, but they weren't anywhere to be found. And so, not really knowing what to do, he just instinctively called his boss and told him what was going on. And his boss just said, "Hold tight, I will send help out to you." And so this driver is left to just stand on the side of the road and wait for help to arrive. And so as he's doing that, he's just staring back down the road in the direction he had just come, as if these tires are just gonna magically appear. And as he's looking in this direction, he starts to notice on the other side of the highway, there are police cars and ambulances streaming into a rest stop that he had just passed. And it was the rest stop where Meg and her 2 friends had been. It would turn out when these 2 tires became dislodged from this truck, they went careening across the highway to the other side, across oncoming traffic, all the way up into this rest stop, and they crashed directly into Meg right as she was climbing back into her car. These 2 tires combined weighed almost 1,000 pounds, and so the impact killed Meg. She was pronounced dead on the scene. After an investigation, it was not conclusively determined what actually caused these tires to fall off. The likely cause was they were missing a small part known as a locking washer that costs $3 and is very easy to acquire. But regardless, at this point, the incident is considered a freak accident. Anna Malaya was born November 4th, 1983, to very poor and alcoholic parents in the Ukraine. In the winter of 1986, when Oksana was only 3 years old, in a drunken stupor, her parents forgot about her outside in the cold of winter. And because she was locked out, instinctively she crawled towards the nearest source of warmth, which was the family's kennel where a whole bunch of dogs were sleeping. And incredibly, once she crawled inside of this kennel, not only did the dogs allow her to sleep there that night, but they kind of embraced her as one of their own. The next day, Oksana did not go back in the house, and her parents seemingly did not notice her absence. And over the next 5 years, Oksana would stay with this family of dogs, essentially living like she was part of their pack, which meant over those 5 very formative years from ages 3 to 8 years old, Oksana had almost no interaction with humans. Oksana rapidly learned how to behave like a dog and began only walking on all 4s. She would bark instead of try to speak, and she would eat raw meat. By the early 90s, Oksana no longer identified as a human. She identified as a dog. And it was in the early 90s when a passerby happened to see Oksana running around on all 4s in the back of her house in the woods, and they called the police, wondering what was wrong with this person. The police show up, and Oksana's dog family runs out and starts barking at the police to protect Oksana, and Oksana would start barking ferociously to protect herself from being captured. But eventually the police would use meat to lure the rest of the dogs away so they could retrieve the child. When she was taken into custody, doctors saw that she not only had forgotten how to walk on 2 legs, she also couldn't speak. And doctors were concerned that because she had had almost no exposure to human language for all those formative early years that she might not actually have the capacity to speak anymore. Oksana was taken to an orphanage where she would eventually learn how to walk on two legs, and amazingly, she would learn how to speak. But despite these incredible gains she made towards re-entering society, her experience living with the dogs had really left a mark on her. Although she could speak, she could only speak in monotone with no rhythm and no intonation, and it was actually difficult to follow what she was saying because of that. A psychologist did an assessment of Oksana and determined that her mental capacity was only that of a 6-year-old, despite being a young adult at the time of this assessment. By the time she was 22 years old and had more or less re-entered society, she finally was able to have a boyfriend, and he didn't know much about her past. But when she decided to show him how easy it was for her to run around and bark like a dog, it apparently scared him, and he broke up with her and did not see her again. Today, Oksana lives on a farm taking care of animals, and she was recently interviewed on a Ukrainian talk show where she says she no longer wants to live like or act like a dog, she just wants to be a person. Here is some footage of Oksana Malaya acting like a dog. On August 9th, 1989, 23-year-old Duncan McPherson pulled his little red car into a parking lot inside of a lush green valley in Austria. After parking his car, Duncan reached across his middle console and he grabbed an apple out of a bag, and then he took a bite and just admired the unbelievable landscape all around him. He was near the Austrian Alps, and so there were literally just mountains jutting up everywhere. Duncan, who was originally from Canada, had been this highly touted, unbelievable first-round draft pick by the New York Islanders back in 1984. The Islanders are a professional ice hockey team in the United States. But despite Duncan's incredible promise and athleticism, he just couldn't ever get it together, and so he never actually made the New York Islanders' big league roster. And so, in 1989, Duncan started to realize that maybe his hockey career was coming to an end. But instead of just hanging up his skates in frustration, Duncan decided he would pursue a different type of career that kept him still within the hockey world. He would become a coach. And so, in 1989, Duncan had agreed to coach this small-time professional hockey team in Scotland. And for Duncan, his thought was, I'll go there, I'll learn how to be a good coach, and then down the road, I'll maybe have the opportunity to coach much more prominent and prestigious teams. But before moving to Scotland and beginning this new career, Duncan decided what he really needed right now was just to take a break, because for basically his whole life, Duncan had been playing hockey around the clock, practically 7 days a week. You don't get to become a first-round draft pick unless hockey is your life. And so Duncan thought, you know what, before I begin this huge life transition, I'm gonna just kick back and relax and go on a huge European vacation. And one of the first stops of this vacation was going to be the Austrian Alps right in front of him. However, he wasn't just going to look at these incredible mountains, he was going to snowboard down them. Or more specifically, he was going to learn how to snowboard on these incredible mountains. And so Duncan finished eating his apple and then chucked the core into the bag, and then he hopped out of his car, shut the door, locked it, and then began walking across the parking lot towards the white gondola station. A gondola is like a ski lift, but much bigger. It's kind of like a small bus with lots of windows, and it's connected to a cable, and that cable, which is elevated off the ground, pulls you up and down mountains. Now, typically, people ride gondolas just for the incredible view of the mountain from up high. But some gondolas are actually in place to take people to specific locations in the mountain. And typically these locations are areas that are not accessible otherwise. You need a gondola to get there. And in Duncan's case, the gondola that he was about to hitch a ride on was of the latter variety. It carried passengers from the station near this parking lot high up into the Austrian Alps, up to about 10,000 feet of elevation, where there was another gondola station called the Eisgrot Mountain Station. And right next to the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station was a very unique ski resort called the Stubai Glacier. And overwhelmingly, this ski resort was the reason why people were taking this gondola. This ski resort was unique not only because it was very hard to get to, you basically had to take a gondola or hike up to it, but also because the actual slope that skiers and snowboarders would use at this resort was not just a snowy mountainside like virtually all other ski resorts around the world are. No, instead, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort was a glacier. And so people were literally skiing and snowboarding on a glacier, hence the name. And a glacier, in simple terms, is just a huge swath of thick, permanently frozen ice. And so, in the warmer months, when other ski resorts around the world were not able to continue operations because there was no snow or it was too warm to make snow, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort did not have that problem because in those warmer months, they could just drive their huge snowcat tractors with their big rakes behind them all over the slope, the glacier, and their rakes would basically chop up the top layer of the ice, turning it into powder for people to ski on, which allowed them to basically stay open every day of the year. And so Duncan, back down in the parking lot, he walked over to the gondola station, he bought his gondola ticket, and then he hitched a ride on the first gondola that swung through the station. And after a slow but beautiful ride up into the mountains, where all that lush greenery down below in the valley was replaced by jagged snow and ice up in the Alps, Duncan finally saw the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort and the glacier itself right behind it that stretched up to the top of the mountain. A few minutes later, the gondola Duncan was on arrived at the Ysgrot Mountain Gondola Station, and Duncan, along with the others inside of the gondola, hopped off, and then Duncan immediately walked over to the resort and headed into the equipment rental store. And after getting his snowboard and his boots and all the other equipment he would need, he headed right back outside to wait for his instructor to arrive. Duncan had previously purchased a lesson with an instructor at the resort. It was set for 11 a.m. And so Duncan, he's out there at the foot of this glacier, and right at 11, an instructor walks over and introduces himself, and Duncan and the instructor immediately start getting into the basics of snowboarding, how to put your boots into your bindings, how to use the edges of your board. And then for a little while, the instructor and Duncan didn't go up the glacier. Instead, they just kind of worked on some basics on the flat ground right there. And then after the instructor felt like Duncan was ready to go, they both walked over to the tow rope, which is a way to get to the top of the slope. There's a cable that kind of rotates from the top to the bottom of the mountain, and there are all these bars attached to the cable, and skiers and snowboarders grab the bar while standing on their snowboard or their skis, and they literally get pulled up the mountain. And so Duncan and the instructor grabbed onto the tow rope, they made their way to the top of the glacier, and from there they pushed over to the start of the run. And once they were there, the instructor strapped into his snowboard, and then Duncan strapped into his, and then they were off, very slowly making their way, kind of like a falling leaf pattern. Duncan was not just going straight down the mountain, he's a beginner, and so it's very slow, very controlled, and as they went down, the instructor's giving Duncan tips, how to stay more on his edge, how to slow down, how to speed up. And very quickly, the instructor saw that Duncan was so good at balancing, his legs were so strong, likely because he was a professional hockey player. And so the instructor was telling Duncan the whole time they're going down how unbelievably good he was doing for his first lesson. And so finally, after about an hour of very slowly making their way all the way down this glacier, they reached the bottom where they had first been doing some flat ground stuff. And when they got there, it had started to rain. And it was raining bad enough that lots of people on the mountain were abandoning the mountain and running inside of the resort to get out from under the rain. And so the instructor, he looked at his watch and he realized they were almost at 1 p.m., which was the end of their lesson. And he said to Duncan, I don't think we have time to go back up. Plus it's raining. Duncan said he didn't care about the rain, but he also understood that, it wasn't ideal conditions. And so they decided that even though there was a few minutes left, they would just cancel the lesson right there, and they would actually just go inside and grab lunch together. And so they made their way out of the rain into the resort, and when they went inside the resort, the instructor noticed that Duncan's sweater, which was underneath his yellow rain jacket, was totally soaked. And so he offered to Duncan, hey, do you want to take your sweater off and I'll hang it up inside my office, and by the end of the day it should be dry. And Duncan thought, great, that's fine. So he took off his wet sweater, he gave it to the instructor, and while the instructor was going to his office, Duncan went into the gift shop and he just bought a new sweater for the day. And after that, Duncan had his new sweater on with his rain jacket over it, and then he met the instructor in the cafeteria where they both sat down and had a nice meal. They got to know each other a little bit better. After they were done eating, both of them looked out the window and saw the rain had subsided, but in its place was lots of fog that was rolling in, and so very few people were going back onto the mountain. But the instructor told Duncan that, hey, you did so good today that you should really go back out there on your own this afternoon and practice. Do some runs, go nice and slow, same as I was teaching you, and then tomorrow, when we have our follow-up lesson, we can maybe, get into some more advanced things. Duncan thought that was a great idea. He said he would definitely go out there and practice on his own. And then the two men cleaned up, and the instructor made his way to meet his next client, and Duncan headed right outside, grabbed his snowboard, and began walking towards the tow rope. The next morning, Duncan's snowboard instructor arrived a little bit early to work. And so after getting off the gondola, he made his way over to the resort and he grabbed a cup of coffee in the same cafeteria where he and Duncan had eaten the day before. And then after finishing that coffee, the instructor grabbed his snowboard and the rest of his gear and then headed outside to meet Duncan in the meeting spot they had both agreed on. But when it was time for the lesson to start, Duncan didn't show up. And so the instructor for a second thought, was there somewhere else we were going to meet? Did I get the time wrong? But he checked the time and he remembered the conversation he had with Duncan. They were going to meet at the foot of the tow rope and he was right there and Duncan wasn't. And so he thought, okay, maybe Duncan's running late. But he waited and waited and waited and Duncan never showed up. The instructor was bummed because he and Duncan really had kind of become friends the day before, and he was looking forward to teaching Duncan some more today, but the instructor knew it was pretty common for tourists to cancel their follow-up snowboard or ski lessons. It's like they show up for that first day, they get really into it, they plan on going the next day, but then other distractions in their vacation pull them elsewhere and they no-show for the lesson. And so the instructor didn't take it personally. He just assumed that, Duncan had found something else to do that was more fun. But the instructor knew he would see Duncan again because Duncan's sweater was still sitting in the instructor's office. 1 week later, Duncan's parents, who were back home in Saskatoon, Canada, got a very unexpected phone call from the Dundee Tigers hockey team, which was the professional hockey team in Scotland that Duncan was going to go coach after this big European vacation. The team rep for this hockey team asked the parents if they knew where their son was because he had not shown up for his first day of work. And Duncan's parents, they immediately were like, that doesn't make any sense. He was so excited about this job. This is a really big deal for him. He would never miss the first day. And so the parents told the team rep that they would try to get in touch with Duncan, and as soon as they did, they'd be in touch with the team, and the team rep said they would do the exact same thing for the parents. However, after this call, the parents quickly realized that trying to get in touch with their son was going to be nearly impossible. They knew Duncan had gone on this big European vacation, but they didn't have his itinerary. They didn't know what countries he was going to, in what order. They really only knew that he was really excited and he was just going to be on vacation. That was kind of it. And remember, this is 1989. They can't just call Duncan. There weren't cell phones. They didn't have the easy modern ways that we all communicate instantly. And so the parents are like, who do we even call? Where do we go? What do we do? And so ultimately, even though this felt kind of dramatic at the time, the parents decided to file a missing person report with Interpol, which is an organization that connects police across international lines. However, the parents quickly learned that this missing person report was not going to become a high priority item for any police anywhere in Europe, because their son was 23, he's healthy, he's strong, he's smart, he's of sound mind, and really all that had happened was Duncan had missed a single day of work on the back end of a huge vacation. So there's lots of reasons why that could have happened. Maybe he extended his vacation. Yeah, it's not professional, but it's totally possible. Or maybe he doesn't want to take the job after all. Or maybe he's just running late. I mean, there's a lot of very logical explanations for why Duncan didn't show up. And so, in short, the parents were told that if you want to find your son right now and not just wait for him to reappear, well, you better go looking yourself. And without hesitation, that's exactly what Duncan's parents did. They packed up a couple of suitcases and they headed to Europe to go find their son. Because to them, it felt like something was wrong here and there was no time to waste. But again, the parents have no idea where their son would have gone in Europe. And so they don't really have a good starting point. They don't know who to talk to. But they just began chasing down every single seemingly insignificant lead they came across, and as they traveled all over Europe, they hung up thousands and thousands of flyers that showed their son's face, said he was missing, and here's a number to call if you know where he is. But despite these efforts, the parents really got nowhere. That is, until about a month into their search, when still they have not found Duncan, they have no idea where he is, they've chased down all these leads, they've all dead-ended. And at this time, the parents convinced several news outlets around Europe to air a segment on their news about Duncan. And one of those missing person segments aired in Austria. And the news anchor in Austria, when they were doing the segment, they described the car that Duncan was almost definitely driving when he went missing. It was that little red car. The parents had discovered in chasing down their leads that their son had borrowed the little red car from a childhood friend who used to play hockey with him, and the friend had told the parents that he had lent it to Duncan, and Duncan had told him he would have it for a week and then return it. But Duncan had never returned the car. And so the anchor in Austria does this segment about how Duncan is missing, and if you have information, come forward. They describe the little red car, and sure enough, not long after this segment aired in Austria, somebody found Duncan's car. It was still sitting in that parking lot right near the Stubai Glacier gondola. Immediately, when Duncan's parents heard about this, they flew to Austria and they met with police who brought them out to look at their son's car. They hadn't moved it. It was still just sitting where he had left it. And then also police showed the parents what they had found inside of the car, which included Duncan's passport, a letter to his girlfriend, where he talked about how excited he was to go to Scotland, and also a bag of rotten fruit. The police also told the parents that now, with the discovery of this vehicle, they were going to really lean into this missing person case to try to find their son, and that the next day they were going to launch this huge search of the area near where his car was to hopefully find Duncan. And so the parents, who were now cautiously optimistic that they might get some answers, they left the police and they went to a local hotel to rest up before the next day when they would be up early and join this huge search party. But when they got to that local hotel, they did what they always did everywhere they went in Europe. They began handing out all these missing person flyers with Duncan's face on them to everybody they saw in the lobby. They began hanging them up all over the hotel. And sure enough, just by completely random chance, they handed one of these flyers to Duncan's snowboard instructor. They handed it to him, he looked at it, and he did a double take, and he was like, I know him. And he explained how he taught Duncan how to snowboard, and then Duncan didn't show up the next day, and he just figured, okay, he blew it off to go do something else, but he'd come back for his sweater. But he never came back for his sweater, and he never heard from Duncan again. And so the parents, they have been searching all of Europe for a month, and they haven't talked to anybody who knew Duncan. They've gotten nowhere, and now they've just randomly stumbled on probably the last person to see Duncan before he went missing. And so they kept asking the instructor, give us more information. What was his attitude like? Was he stressed out? Was he scared? Was he worried about something? Where did he go? Give us anything. But the instructor really didn't have that much more information to offer. And so he tried to answer all their questions, but really just finally said, look, I'm sorry. All I know is after we ate lunch together on the 9th, Duncan said he was going to go out and do some practice runs, but I never actually saw him go up. I didn't see him come down. I just assumed he went up there and was kind of on his own for the day. And then, of course, the next day I didn't see him and he never came back. And so I'm sorry. That's all I know. And so the parents finally said, thank you so much for the information. Please get in touch with us if you remember anything. And the instructor said he would. And then after that, the parents made their way to their room and they went to bed. The next morning, the parents got up early and they headed to that parking lot where Duncan's car was. And there were all these people, police officers and volunteers that were there to be a part of this big search party. And so after the parents explained to the leaders of the search party what the instructor had told them, that very likely their son had been up at the Stubai Glacier ski resort when he went missing, the entire search party quickly hopped on gondolas and made their way up there. And all day, This search party combed this glacier up and down. They walked all around to the backside of this mountain. They rappelled down cliffs and they hiked all over this entire segment of the mountain, but nobody found anything that gave away where Duncan had gone. And the next day, it was the same story. Huge search party looking everywhere, expanding the search, not just Stubai Glacier, but basically all over this entire swath of mountain range. But still, they found nothing. And so, at the end of the second day, the authorities went up to Duncan's parents and they told them that unfortunately, we can't continue this search. We're calling it off. But Duncan's parents, they didn't call off the search. They continued searching for another 14 years. And over that time frame, they went back to Stubai Glacier over and over and over again. They searched it up and down. They knew all the staff members. They knew all the nooks and crannies of the entire place, but they never found any sign of their son. Fast forward to July of 2003, so 14 years after Duncan had gone missing. And a Stubai Glacier ski resort employee was riding the tow rope towards the top of the mountain when they noticed there was a bright yellow piece of trash right in the middle of the slope. And so the employee rode the tow rope just a little bit higher, and then he let go and skied down to this yellow thing. He reached down and he began pulling on this piece of yellow, and suddenly he stopped. And absolutely horrified, he realized this was not trash. While no one knows for sure what happened to Duncan, here is the leading theory that Duncan's family and authorities, for the most part, agree on. Back on August 9th, 1989, after having lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan was feeling motivated to go back out and take some practice runs. And so he headed outside, he looked up at the glacier, there's all this fog rolling in, but it's not raining, and so nobody's on the slope, and so it's perfect for a beginner. He's gonna have this place to himself. And so he grabs his board, he makes his way over to the tow rope, he straps in, he grabs onto a bar, and he makes his way to the top. Once he gets off, he makes his way over to the start of the run, he puts his other foot into his binding, he makes sure he's all set, and then he stood up and began slowly kind of waffling his way down the completely vacant and very foggy slope. And as he was going along, he got more and more confident and began going a little bit faster and a little bit faster until finally he was basically just bombing it down the mountain, relying on his natural balance and strength to kind of keep him up. And then all of a sudden, he caught an edge and flipped forward and smashed into the ground. And when he did, he broke his leg. The unique danger to humans when it comes to glaciers is something called a crevasse. Basically, cracks form in the ice, and sometimes these cracks can be massive, like mind-bogglingly massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet, that if you fall into this thing, you're done. No one's getting you out of there. You are falling either to your death, or you're falling so far down that no one can get to you. Or, like in the case of Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, they had the issue of little crevasses forming kind of all over the place. Especially if it rained, the rain would begin to crack the ice, or if maybe it was warmer than usual, the ice would crack here and there. And so the resort was really good about constantly patrolling their slope to make sure no crevasses had formed anywhere on the slope. And so when you got to Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, you were warned that there is such a thing as a crevasse. This is a real glacier, so make sure you're looking around and don't fall into one. Well, because it had rained, a crevasse had formed, a small one, like a pothole, in the slope, but because it was so foggy because of the rain, as Duncan was bombing down, he didn't see it, and that's what he caught his edge on, causing him to fall and break his leg. And so Duncan, he's now stranded in the middle of the slope. He's not close enough to the bottom to where he could pull himself into the resort. He's not close enough to the top where he could get himself up there and talk to the tow lift operator. And so he's just kind of stranded. There's nobody on the mountain. It's so foggy, nobody can see him from the resort. And so he's just stuck in agonizing pain, wondering what he's supposed to do. At the same time this was happening, another ski resort employee was climbing into one of those big snowcat tractors at the top of the glacier. These tractors were what the resort used to chop the top layer of ice and turn it into snow. And because it had rained that day, a lot of the snow had melted, and so this employee needed to basically go over the entire slope from top to bottom and grind up the ice and make some new snow. And so the employee hopped in the cab of this tractor, shut the door, turned on the engine, turned on the back rake, which in your head, picture a long stretch of metal dragging behind this tractor that had rotating blades that cut into the snow as it moved along. And so this employee, after turning on the rake and making sure everything worked, they drove the snowcat and the rake onto the start of the downward slope, and they began crisscrossing back and forth across the entire slope, turning it all into fresh snow. And as this employee drove, they were very careful not to go too quick because they knew they couldn't see very far with all of the fog. And so they're going like 1 or 2 miles an hour, being very cautious. And then suddenly at the last second, they see something in the snow. It kind of appeared out of the fog. And so the employees swerved as fast as they could to avoid hitting it. And they did narrowly miss it. Their big tank-like treads that are on these tractors just missed running this thing over. However, the back rake with the rotating blades did not miss this object. It went right over it. The employee immediately parked the snowcat and then leapt outside and ran over to see what this thing was. And when they got there, they could not believe what they saw. It was Duncan. And all those rotating blades that had crossed over him had basically mutilated him. One of his arms had been cut off, one of his legs was nearly cut off, but it's believed Duncan was actually not dead. The injuries were horrible, but they would not necessarily have killed him outright. He would bleed to death without help, but in theory, he could have been saved. But the employee, even though this was a total accident, totally panicked and decided that because it was so foggy, no one must have seen this. No one was around, and so no one would know that they were the ones who ran this guy over. And so instead of helping Duncan, they just tied him up and dragged him behind the snowcat off of the glacier over to this area where this employee knew there was a very deep crevasse. And they chucked Duncan, who might have been alive at this point, into the crevasse along with his arm and his severed leg, and then the employee used the snowcat tractor to rake over the crevasse. They filled it all in and packed it down, and then they drove down the rest of the way and just hoped no one would ever know. But over the course of the next 14 years, the glacier would melt more and more each year until finally Duncan's yellow jacket popped through the ice. And that's what the resort employees saw as they were going up the tow lift and thought it was trash. It was actually Duncan's jacket. They skied over, they tried to pull it out of the snow, only to then see, literally in the ice, Duncan McPherson looking right back up at them. And Duncan still looked like he was 23 years old because he had been frozen this entire time. According to the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, Duncan must have just fallen into this crevasse and died. That's what they say happened, and some authorities say that is what happened. But when they pulled Duncan out of the ice and they found his body had been chopped apart and his snowboard had even been chopped apart, that told a very different story. As for the snowcat driver who drove over Duncan, they were never actually officially identified or charged with any crime because there was a statute of limitations that had run out by 2003. And so no one has ever been held accountable for Duncan's death. So that's going to do it.